Chapter 14, A New Birth of Freedom, The Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The American Civil War has been called the first modern war. This was the first time mass armies fought with weapons forged by the Industrial Revolution, and the scale of casualties was unprecedented in American history. The war became a conflict between societies as the distinction between military and civilian targets diminished. Wars like this depend on the effectiveness of political leaders, the capacity to mobilize economic resources, and a society's determination to continue the war despite failures. The Union seemed favored over the Confederacy. The North, including loyal border states, had a population of 22 million, while the South had only 9 million, 3.5 million of whom were slaves. The Union had far more manufacturing, railroad track, and financial resources. Yet, to end the rebellion, the Union had to invade and conquer a huge area and defeat spirited Confederate soldiers defending homes and families. Even if the South lost most battles, it could win by exhausting the enemy. The outbreak of war stimulated powerful feelings of patriotism, and recruits hastened to enlist, thinking the war would be short and glorious. Both sides later resorted to a draft, the Confederacy in 1862, the Union the next year. By 1865, more than 2 million men had served in the Union Army and 900,000 in the Confederate. Few soldiers had any military experience, and their notions of war were romantic. Soldiers and officers did not anticipate how technological advances changed warfare. The Civil War was the first major conflict in which the railroad moved troops and supplies. The war saw the famous battle between the Union vessel Monitor and the Confederate Merrimac in 1862, which showed the advantage of ironclads over wooden ships and transformed naval warfare. The telegraph, observation balloons, and even hand grenades and submarines were used for the first time. Most important was the revolution in arms manufacturing, which replaced the musket, accurate only at a short range, with the rifle, deadly at 600 or more yards because of its grooved barrel. This changed the nature of combat, making far more important heavy fortifications and trenches and giving defensive forces, usually Confederates, a significant advantage. This development produced the awful casualties of the war's battles. Medical care was primitive, and large numbers of Americans for the first time were captured and held as prisoners of war in camps, leading to high death rates. At least 620,000 died in the war, the equivalent of more than 6 million in today's population, and more than the entire number of Americans killed in all other wars in U.S. history, from the Revolution to Iraq. The Civil War was also modern in the use of propaganda by both sides to mobilize public opinion. In the North, patriotic organizations and the War Department reaffirmed Northern values, portrayed the Democratic Party as treasonous, and accused the South of crimes against Union soldiers and loyal civilians. The South engaged in similar campaigns. Modern media, with newspapers, telegraphs, and especially photographs, for the first time captured the often shocking reality of war and communicated it to the public. Both sides were unprepared for war. There was no national banking system, no tax system to raise revenue for the war, and few accurate maps of the South. After Fort Sumter, Lincoln enacted a blockade of the South intended to destroy its commerce, but the Navy at first had too few ships to enforce it. The problems of purchasing and distributing food, weapons, and other supplies for the armies were huge. While the Union Army eventually became the best fed and best supplied force in history, Southern soldiers lacked food, uniforms, and shoes. Lacking sufficient industrial capacity, the Confederate government imported many items for the military from abroad and established its own arsenals. Each side tried to exploit its advantages. The South by adopting a defensive strategy to wear down the North, led by the brilliant Robert E. Lee, and the North by using its superiority in manpower and technology. But the Northern Army was at first small, its officers and leadership were poor, and it focused on capturing Richmond, the Confederacy's capital, a difficult task. Lincoln soon realized that capturing and occupying territory would not win the war. Defeating the South's armies would. Lincoln's eventual embrace of emancipation acknowledged that slavery was the basis of the Confederacy and that to win the conflict, the Union had to make this institution, the economic and social foundation of the South, a military target. Most of the war in the East occurred in a narrow corridor between Washington and Richmond, as a series of Union generals led the North's Army of the Potomac toward the Confederate capital, only to be repeatedly repulsed by the main Confederate army. The first significant clash at Bull Run ended the defeat and chaotic retreat of Union forces. This battle ended the widespread belief that the war would end quickly. George B. McClellan soon took command of the Union's main army, but after thoroughly training this army's tens of thousands of volunteer soldiers, he proved reluctant to commit them to battle. McClellan was a Democrat, and he hoped that compromise might end the conflict without many casualties or weakening slavery. Pressured by public opinion, President Lincoln, and Congress, McClellan, in the spring of 1862, led his army of more than 100,000 men into Virginia. Approaching the Confederate capital on the peninsula southwest of Richmond, McClellan's advance was ably deflected by Lee in a series of battles, forcing McClellan back to Washington, D.C. After Lee won the Second Battle of Bull Run in August 1862, he invaded the North, hoping to bring border slave states into the Confederacy, gain French and British recognition of Southern independence, influence the North's elections in the fall, and perhaps capture Washington, D.C. At the Battle of Antietam, McClellan and the Army of the Potomac repelled Lee's invasion. In one day at Antietam, nearly 4,000 men were killed and 18,000 wounded. More Americans died in this battle on September 17, 1862, than on any other day in American history, including Pearl Harbor and D-Day in World War II and the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Northern triumph was short-lived. General Ambrose E. Burnside, who replaced McClellan, was repulsed by Lee's army at Fredericksburg, Virginia in December 1862 with heavy losses. The North had better luck in the West. There, Ulysses S. Grant, a West Point graduate whose Army career had been ruined by his excessive drinking, captured several important forts in Tennessee in early 1862. In April 1862, naval forces under Admiral David G. Farragut streamed into New Orleans and captured the city for the Union, which now controlled the South's largest city and its lucrative nearby sugar plantations. After Grant repelled a surprise Confederate attack at Shiloh, Tennessee, Union success in the West stalled. The Civil War had revolutionary effects on American society, the most important of which was the destruction of slavery, the fundamental institution of Southern society. The emancipation of America's 4 million slaves, in numbers, scale, and economic value, was far greater than any other emancipation of slaves or serfs in the world. At the war's beginning, Lincoln identified the North's cause with the cause of free labor, but Lincoln also initially stated that the conflict was not being fought to end or limit slavery, but to preserve the Union. He wanted to keep the border slave states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri in the Union and built the broadest possible base of support for the war in the North. As Confederates used slave labor for military purposes and blacks began to escape to Union lines, this initial policy of ignoring slavery became untenable. By the end of 1861, Union commanders had begun treating escaped slaves as contrabands of war, property of military value subject to confiscation. Southern blacks themselves took actions that propelled the Union toward ending slavery. Well before Lincoln's Emancipation Act, slaves saw the war as an opportunity to gain their freedom. Thousands escaped to the safety of Union lines, crippling many plantations. In areas occupied by Northern soldiers, slaves refused to work unless paid. Anti-slavery Northerners pressed the federal government to realize that slavery was the basis of the Southern economy and its military capacities, and they insisted emancipation was required in order to weaken the South. Abolitionists and radical Republicans demanded, none more adamantly than Frederick Douglass, that abolition become a war aim. Congress, frustrated by military failures, prohibited the Army from returning fugitive slaves, abolished slavery in Washington, D.C., and the territories, and passed the Second Confiscation Act, which freed slaves of disloyal owners in Union-occupied territory and slaves who escaped to Union lines. But Lincoln reversed the policies of Union generals who declared emancipation in their districts, and he still endorsed colonization as a solution to slavery. In summer 1862, Lincoln decided that emancipation had become a military and political necessity. He delayed his intention to free the slaves until after a Union victory, and after the Battle of Antietam, he issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Democrats in the North used this declaration to gain votes, arguing that Republicans threatened to inundate the North with cheap black labor and allow blacks to marry white women. The Democrats gained considerable political victories in some northern states, and Lincoln, now on the defensive, revived plans for gradual emancipation and colonization and downplayed racial equality. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed and issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The document did not free all the slaves and at first applied to very few. Based on Lincoln's authority as military commander-in-chief, the proclamation exempted areas under Union control. Thus, it did not apply to loyal border slave states that had not seceded or to parts of the Confederacy occupied by Union forces, such as Tennessee and parts of Virginia and Louisiana. But it declared free the vast majority of the South's slaves, more than 3 million men, women, and children. Still behind Confederate lines, these slaves would be free only when Union military success made them so. The Emancipation Proclamation made the Union Army an agent of freedom and promised the death of slavery by combining the goals of abolition and the Union. It altered the nature of the Civil War and the course of American history. It also represented a change in Lincoln's thinking. Lincoln did not mention compensating slaveholders for the loss of their slaves, nor did he mention colonization. The order committed the North to enlisting black soldiers in the Union Army. Emancipation in the United States, unlike elsewhere, was immediate and offered no compensation. It anticipated the demise of slavery in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Brazil, which was the last nation to abolish slavery in the Western Hemisphere in 1888. Now, the Civil War, begun to preserve the nation, now promised a revolutionary transformation of Southern life and a redefinition of American freedom. Without colonization, emancipation meant incorporating freed slaves into American life. A new system of labor, politics, and race relations would have to replace slavery. The proclamation's provision allowing blacks to enlist in the Army had far-reaching effects. Although the Navy allowed blacks to serve as sailors, they had been excluded from the Army. Lincoln's administration first refused to allow blacks to enlist, fearing that it would alienate white soldiers and border slave states that stayed in the Union. But a few Union commanders enlisted soldiers who were contraband, as happened in South Carolina. Only with the Emancipation Proclamation did significant black enlistment begin. By the end of the war, 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army and 24,000 in the Union Navy. 1/3 died in battle from wounds or disease. Black soldiers and units received considerable notoriety after showing great heroism in battle, such as the 54th Massachusetts and its assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina in 1863. Most black soldiers were emancipated slaves who joined the Army in the South. Many were slaves from loyal border states excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation, where enlistment was, for most of the war, the only road to freedom. Military service was liberating for many black soldiers who earned a new sense of dignity and rights. As veterans, many of these troops became community and political leaders, including many of the Reconstruction era. Within the Army, however, black troops received discriminatory treatment, including being led only by white officers, being more often assigned to work rather than combat duty, and at first receiving unequal pay. They were targeted by Confederates who executed some black prisoners. But black soldiers' service ensured that they could make claims on the government for equal rights and citizenship in the war's aftermath. Because it radically transformed American government and society, some historians call the American Civil War the Second American Revolution. Notions of freedom were contested and transformed by the war. Union victory secured the North's understanding of freedom as self-ownership and owning one's own labor, as opposed to the South's vision of freedom as mastership over others. The war advanced abolitionists' definition of freedom, and Lincoln's emancipation of the slaves reinforced Americans' sense that their nation was a progressive force in world history. Lincoln did the most to link the war with Northern values. The American Civil War was part of a worldwide phenomenon of nation building. Throughout the world, powerful, centralized nation-states developed in old countries and new nations emerged where none had ever existed. Modern states consolidated their power and reduced local autonomy. Japan and Argentina are two examples where this occurred, and where rapid economic development quickly followed national unification. Lincoln has even been called the American Mazzini or Bismarck, figures who respectively created nation-states in Italy and Germany. But Lincoln's America, unlike these nations, was based on universal ideas of political democracy, human liberty, and self-government. Other nations were based on particular identities of ethnicity, culture, and language. In his November 1863 Gettysburg Address commemorating the battle's dead, Lincoln reaffirmed that all men are created equal and stated the war heralded a new birth of freedom. Union soldiers' sacrifices would ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.